began as a dream. But over time, it became an obsession that refused to die. In 1095, a single speech changed the course of history. When Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at the Council of Clermont, he called upon Christians across Europe to take up arms and reclaim the Holy Land, Jerusalem, from Muslim control. What followed was something no one had fully expected. Thousands answered. Knights, peasants, nobles, men from every corner of Europe marched east, driven by faith, fear, and the promise of salvation. Against all odds, the First Crusade succeeded. By 1099, Jerusalem had been captured, and several Crusader states were established, including the powerful Kingdom of Jerusalem. For a moment, it seemed like divine favor had secured a permanent victory. But beneath that success, there was a hidden weakness. The Crusaders had not conquered a united enemy. The Muslim world at the time was divided, fragmented into rival states, each more concerned with internal struggles than resisting foreign invaders. This disunity gave the Crusaders an advantage they did not fully understand, because it would not last. Over the next decades, the balance began to shift. Muslim leaders started to unify their forces, slowly rebuilding strength and coordination. Among them rose one of the most formidable figures of the medieval world, Saladin. Saladin was more than a general. He was a unifier. Under his leadership, Muslim armies became organized, disciplined, and focused on a single goal: driving the Crusaders out. The turning point came in 1187. At the Battle of Hattin, Crusader forces were decisively defeated. Soon after, Jerusalem, once the shining prize of the First Crusade, fell back into Muslim hands. The psychological impact on Europe was immense. The dream of permanent control shattered, but the Crusades did not end. Instead, they became something darker, more desperate. For the next century, European powers launched repeated campaigns to reclaim what had been lost. Some achieved temporary successes, capturing coastal cities and fortresses, but none could restore the Kingdom of Jerusalem to its former glory. The Crusader states shrank, reduced to isolated strongholds along the Mediterranean coast, fragile, vulnerable, and constantly under threat. Then came 1244. Jerusalem was attacked once again, this time with devastating force. The city was sacked, its defenses broken, and whatever remained of Crusader hopes in the Holy Land was crushed. Reports reached Europe describing destruction so complete that only a few hundred Christian fighters were left in the region. It was more than a defeat. It was a warning that the old methods had failed, a warning that the dream was slipping away. And yet, instead of letting it die, Europe chose to fight again, because some dreams, no matter how broken, refused to disappear. Before Louis IX ever set foot in Egypt, before the Seventh Crusade was even imagined, there was already a warning written in failure. It came from the Fifth Crusade. By the early 13th century, Crusader leaders had finally realized something critical. Attacking Jerusalem directly was no longer enough. The city was no longer the true center of power. Egypt was. Rich, strategic, and heavily fortified, Egypt was the backbone of Muslim resistance. Whoever controlled it controlled the fate of the Holy Land. So the Crusaders made a bold decision. They would strike Egypt first. Their target was the city of Damietta, located at the mouth of the Nile, a gateway into the heart of the Egyptian world. If they could seize it, they believed they could march inland, capture Cairo, and force the Muslims into surrender. At first, everything went according to plan. The Crusaders launched their assault, and after a long and difficult siege, they captured Damietta. It was a massive victory, one that seemed to confirm their new strategy was correct. But victory can be dangerous because it creates confidence, and confidence can turn into arrogance. Instead of securing their position and strengthening their hold over the Nile Delta, the Crusaders pushed forward. They believed momentum was on their side. They believed Egypt was vulnerable. They believed they were winning. Leading this advance was Pelagius of Albano, a papal legate who held immense authority, but lacked real military experience. His decisions would shape the fate of the entire campaign, and they would prove disastrous. Ignoring the advice of more experienced commanders, Pelagius ordered the army to march toward Cairo. It was a bold move, but one built on a dangerous misunderstanding of the terrain. Because Egypt was not like Europe. It was not a battlefield of open plains and predictable routes. It was a land controlled by water. The Nile River was not just a river, it was a weapon. As the Crusaders advanced, the situation began to change. The Muslim forces did not rush into open battle. Instead, they waited, watching, calculating, and preparing. Then the Nile began to rise. Floodwaters spread across the land. Canals filled. Routes that had once been clear became impassable. The Crusader army, deep in unfamiliar territory, suddenly found itself surrounded, not by soldiers, but by water. And then came the final blow. Muslim forces took control of key waterways behind the Crusaders, cutting off their retreat. Escape became impossible. Supplies ran low. Panic spread. The army that had once marched with confidence was now trapped. There was no heroic last stand, no glorious victory, only desperation. In the end, the Crusaders were forced to surrender. Despite holding Damietta, despite their earlier success, they had no choice but to give it back in exchange for their lives. It was a complete collapse, a disaster caused not by lack of strength, but by poor decisions, overconfidence, and a failure to understand the battlefield. The lesson was clear. Egypt could not be conquered so easily. The Nile was not just a river, it was a trap. And yet, when the Seventh Crusade began decades later, that lesson would be forgotten, or worse, ignored. 5. Some crusades began with strategy. This one began with a promise. In 1244, as news of Jerusalem's fall spread across Europe, a young king in France lay close to death. Louis IX of France, ruler of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe, had been struck by a severe illness. His condition was so critical that many believed his reign and his life were coming to an end. And in that moment, he made a vow. If he survived, he would lead a crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. It wasn't a political decision. It wasn't even a strategic one. It was deeply personal. When Louis recovered, against all expectations, he believed it was nothing short of a miracle. To him, it was a sign from God, a calling he could not ignore, and unlike many before him, he kept his word. But Louis IX was not a typical medieval king. He was known for his intense devotion to religion, his strict moral code, and his belief that he ruled not just as a monarch, but as a servant of God. Many would later refer to him as a saint, and even during his lifetime, his faith shaped every decision he made. This gave his crusade something different. Not just ambition, but conviction. Once he committed, Louis moved with determination. He began preparing for war on a scale that Europe had not seen in decades. Massive funds were raised through taxes, including heavy demands placed on the clergy, which sparked anger but provided essential resources. He organized fleets, negotiated with powerful maritime cities, arranged governance for France in his absence, and most importantly, he built an army. This was not just a feudal force of knights bound by land and duty. Louis expanded beyond tradition. He recruited infantry from across his kingdom, hired mercenaries to strengthen his ranks, and secured the support of elite military orders, warriors who had spent their lives fighting in the Holy Land. The Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, men trained not just in battle, but in survival. By the time preparations were complete, Louis had assembled a force estimated at around 15,000 men. It was a formidable army, well-funded, well-equipped, and driven by a powerful sense of purpose. But there was a deeper question beneath it all. Was faith enough? Because while Louis believed he had been chosen, history had already shown that belief alone could not win in Egypt. Still, the king did not hesitate. In August 1248, he departed from France, setting sail toward the eastern Mediterranean. His destination was Cyprus, a gathering point where his forces would assemble before launching the invasion. The journey had begun. A king, driven by a vow, an army united by faith, and a mission that had already failed once before. But Louis believed this time would be different. He believed he could succeed where others had fallen. What he didn't yet realize was that he was walking the same path, toward the same enemy, and toward the same mistake. Cyprus was never meant to be the story. It was supposed to be a pause, a brief stop before the real war began. But sometimes, and the most dangerous part of a campaign, is the part where nothing happens. When Louis IX of France arrived in Cyprus in September 1248, everything seemed under control. The island had been carefully chosen as a staging ground, a place where his army could gather, organize, and prepare before striking Egypt. And at first glance, it looked perfect. Supplies were abundant, warehouses overflowed with grain, wine, and equipment that had been stockpiled for years in anticipation of this very moment. Ships filled the harbors. Reinforcements continued to arrive from across Europe. It felt like preparation. It felt like strength. But beneath the surface, something was beginning to crack. The problem was time. The Crusader army wasn't fully assembled when Louis arrived. Many forces were still scattered, some delayed, others traveling separately. And in the medieval world, timing wasn't flexible. The Mediterranean had strict sailing seasons. If the fleet didn't depart at the right time, they would have to wait. And wait they did. Weeks turned into months. The campaign, which should have moved quickly toward Egypt, was delayed into the winter. And with that delay came consequences no one could control. The weather changed. The air grew cold and damp, and disease began to spread. At first, it was just a few men falling ill, then more and more. Soon, sickness moved through the camp like an invisible enemy, one that no sword could stop. By the time winter had settled in fully, hundreds were dead. At least 250 knights, elite warriors, the backbone of the army, were gone before the war had even begun. And alongside them, countless others weakened, exhausted, or dying in silence. This wasn't a battle. There were no enemies in sight, and yet the army was already losing. Morale began to break. Some soldiers, especially those of lesser means, found themselves trapped in a different kind of struggle. War was expensive. Maintaining armor, horses, food, it all required money. And as the months dragged on, many could no longer afford to stay. Even Jean de Joinville, who would later record these events, nearly collapsed under the financial strain. He had brought knights under his command, paying for their service himself. But as his resources dwindled, those same men threatened to abandon him if he couldn't continue paying them. The army wasn't just fighting disease. It was fighting itself. Desertion became a real fear. Disorder lingered just beneath the surface. The longer they stayed in Cyprus, the more fragile everything became. But Louis refused to let it fall apart. He stepped in where others couldn't. Using his own wealth, he paid soldiers to remain. He enforced strict discipline, even banning men from leaving the island without permission. His authority and his determination became the glue holding the army together. Without him, the crusade might have ended right there, on an island far from the battlefield. Finally, as winter passed and conditions improved, the moment came. In May 1249, the fleet prepared to leave. The army, though weakened, was still intact. They had survived Cyprus, but not without cost, because before they ever faced the enemy, they had already lost time, strength, and momentum, and in a campaign where every decision mattered. That silent disaster would follow them, all the way to Egypt. By the time the Crusader fleet finally left Cyprus in May 1249, everything depended on what came next. For Louis IX of France, the plan was clear and, in his mind, undeniable. Egypt was the key, not Jerusalem, not Acre, Egypt. Because whoever controlled Egypt controlled the wealth, the supply lines, and the military backbone of the Muslim world. Take Egypt, and Jerusalem would fall without needing to be stormed directly. It was a bold idea, and it wasn't entirely wrong, but it came with a dangerous assumption that Egypt was vulnerable. Many in Europe believed this. They saw Egypt as rich but politically unstable, a place where internal divisions might be exploited. Compared to the fortified strongholds of the Levant, Egypt seemed like a softer target, a weak point waiting to be struck. But Egypt was not weak. It was different, and that difference would decide everything. When the Crusaders approached the Nile Delta, they encountered a landscape unlike anything they had fought in before. This was not open terrain suited for heavy cavalry charges and organized formations. This was a world shaped by water. The Nile spread out into countless branches. Canals cut through the land like veins. Marshes flooded fields, and narrow crossings turned a movement into a slow and uncertain process. Routes that looked clear could become impassable overnight. In Egypt, the land itself could fight back. Still, the Crusaders pressed forward. Their first objective was Damietta, the same city targeted during the Fifth Crusade. A strategic fortress at the mouth of the Nile, it served as a gateway into Egypt's interior. If they could take it, they could control access to the river. And once again, history seemed to repeat itself. The Crusader army landed near the city, prepared for resistance. But instead of a fierce battle, they were met with something unexpected. The defenders retreated almost immediately. Damietta fell into Crusader hands with shocking ease. No prolonged siege, no heavy losses, just victory. To Louis and his army, it felt like confirmation that their plan was working. The so-called weak point had been struck, and it had broken faster than anyone imagined. Morale surged. Confidence returned. After the hardships of Cyprus, after the losses and delays, this felt like redemption. Proof that their faith and their strategy had been justified. But there was a problem. It was too easy. What the Crusaders didn't fully understand was that the retreat of Egyptian forces wasn't necessarily defeat. It was a decision. Led by the forces of Sultan Asali Ayub, the Muslim strategy was not to defend blindly, but to preserve strength, to choose the battlefield carefully, and to avoid giving the Crusaders the kind of open confrontation they were built for. Damietta was not the end. It was the beginning. And the deeper the Crusaders moved into Egypt, the more dangerous their position would become. But standing in the captured city, surrounded by success, it was hard to see that. Because victory has a way of blinding those who achieve it. Just as it had during the Fifth Crusade, the Crusaders made the same choice. They didn't stop. They didn't consolidate. They marched forward, toward Cairo, toward the heart of Egypt. And without realizing it, they were stepping into a battlefield they did not control. A battlefield that was already shaping itself around them. A battlefield that was slowly turning into a trap. Victory at Damietta should have been a moment to pause, to regroup, to understand the land they had just entered. But instead, it became the beginning of the end. With the city secured, Louis IX of France faced a critical decision: remain in control of the Nile Delta and strengthen his position, or push forward toward Cairo, the heart of Egypt. He chose to advance. It was the same choice made during the Fifth Crusade, and it would lead to the same fate. As the Crusader army began its march south, reality started to set in. Egypt was not yielding. It was resisting in a different way. The further they moved from Damietta, the more fragile their position became. Supply lines stretched thin, communication slowed, and the land itself turned hostile. The Nile dictated everything. Its branches cut across their path, forcing them to stop, reroute, and wait. Movement became slow and exhausting. Heavy cavalry, the greatest strength of the Crusaders, lost its effectiveness in terrain that offered no room to charge. Every step forward cost them more. Meanwhile, the Muslim forces, once again under the broader command of Asali Ayub, did not rush into open battle. Even as the Sultan's health declined and internal tensions simmered, his commanders understood one thing clearly. Time was on their side. They shadowed the Crusader advance, harassed them, cut off small groups, watched for weakness, and most importantly, they waited. Then came the turning point. Near the town of Al Mansurah, the Crusaders found what looked like an opportunity, a crossing over one of the Nile's branches, a ford, a way through. It was exactly what they needed, or so it seemed. A select force of Crusader knights was sent across first, led by bold and aggressive commanders eager to strike before the enemy could react. The plan was simple: cross quickly, attack the Muslim camp, and break their resistance in one decisive blow. At first, it worked. They crossed successfully. They advanced rapidly, and they reached the outskirts of Al Mansurah. But what they didn't realize was that they had moved too fast, too far, too alone. Because this wasn't a breakthrough. It was bait. As the Crusaders entered the town, they found themselves in a completely different kind of battlefield. The wide, Open spaces they were used to were gone, replaced by narrow streets, tight corners, and enclosed pathways, perfect for an ambush. And waiting for them were elite Muslim warriors, many of them Mamluks, disciplined, fast, and deadly in close combat. The attack came suddenly, from all sides. The Crusaders, disoriented and confined, struggled to respond. Their formations broke. Their horses became a liability in the cramped streets. Knights, trained for open warfare, were cut down in close quarters, where skill mattered less than positioning. Panic spread. What had begun as an attack turned into chaos, and chaos turned into slaughter. Outside the town, the rest of the Crusader army was no better off. Still trying to cross, still dealing with the terrain, they were unable to support the forces trapped inside. The army was divided, and in that division, it lost its strength. The Nile once again became a weapon. Retreat was difficult. Reinforcements were delayed, and the enemy controlled the flow of the battlefield. From that moment on, the Crusaders were no longer advancing. They were surviving. Starvation set in. Disease returned. Constant pressure from enemy forces wore them down. The confidence that had followed the fall of Damietta was gone, replaced by exhaustion, confusion, and fear. The road to Cairo had become a dead end, and Al Mansurah was where everything began to collapse. Because this was not just a lost battle. It was the moment the Crusaders realized they were trapped, and this time there would be no easy escape.